I'm Avidita Acharya, and I'll be introducing the presenter and moderator for today's talk. Today's speaker is Dr. Khushbu Mishra. Dr. Mishra is an assistant professor of economics at Stetson University. Her research covers gender and economic development, agricultural economics, and project evaluation. She has broad experience in these areas, managing field projects in Ghana and Tanzania, in addition to consulting for major international organizations like the World Bank and UNICEF on development projects in Nepal, East Asia, and the Pacific. Her research has been published in journals such as World Development and Agricultural Economics on topics ranging from food security in India during the COVID-19 pandemic to the effects of land ownership on women's empowerment in Nepal. Dr. Mishra earned her PhD in economics from the Ohio State University. The moderator for today's talk will be Dr. Biswo Poudel. Dr. Poudel is a visiting associate professor at Kathmandu University School of Management and the chief economic advisor to the Confederation of Nepalese Industries. He specializes in natural resource economics, labor economics, and economic history. He has previously served as a senior economist in the National Planning Commission of Nepal and has also been an economic advisor to the International Labour Organization. His research has appeared in journals such as the Journal of Agricultural and Applied Economics and the American Journal of Agricultural Economics on topics that include environmental pollution in Latin America, institutional development, and hydropower in Nepal. Dr. Poudel earned his PhD in agricultural economics from the University of California at Berkeley. So now let me remind our participants of the ground rules. Please remember to keep your mics muted unless you are invited to speak. Dr. Mishra will speak for about 40 to 45 minutes. Then we will have a half-hour Q&A session moderated by Dr. Poudel. You may send in your questions via chat to Dr. Poudel or use the raise hand feature on Zoom. After the discussion, Dr. Vishwas Gauchan, Executive Director of IIDS, will formally close today's event. As always, we thank him and Ms. Vinisha Nepal for supporting this series. Okay, Khushbu, the floor is yours.
Hi, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Before I go into my presentation, I would obviously like to thank IIDS for inviting me to speak, and Vinisha and the team for organizing this wonderful series. So the topic today for my presentation is basically, do remittances income, reshape household expenditures. Particularly, we are using data from Nepal to check if that is the case in Nepal. This is a work that has been co-authored with two of my wonderful co-authors, Olga Kondratjeva from Washington University in St. Louis and Gerald E from Purdue University. So before I actually go into my details of presentations, I know that this may be quite early for too many of you and too late for too many of you right now because of the different time zones that we are in. So I'd like to very quickly present a summary of the presentation. So basically, the goal here is that we are investigating the impact of remittance income on household expenditure. And in particular, we are actually looking at 9 total areas of expenditure. So we are looking at expenditures on food consumptions. We are looking at expenditure on alcohol and tobacco, clothing items, as well as ceremonies. So this would be religious festivals, funeral, death. We are looking at healthcare expenditures. We are looking at education expenditures. We're looking at spending on home improvement. We are looking at spending on land purchase as well as livestock purchase. To investigate this, we are using data from the Nepal Living Standards Survey 2010-11, and then the model specification we have are the ordinary least squares and the instrumental variable to SLS approach. So very quickly, we find that remittances are in fact positively associated with expenditures on food, clothing, and education, so all good things. And in fact, greater remittances actually reduce expenditure on so-called bad things, for example, alcohol and tobacco. And we are even found, I would say, relatively new evidence that remittances actually even undermine or reduce expenditures associated with agriculture and livestock. Very quickly again, what exactly is the motivation? Why should we even study this question? Why is this important? So as many of us are already aware, disparities in economic opportunities and therefore disparities in earnings push many family members to migrate either within or across nations. While across nations have been quite common, while within nations have been quite common with more infrastructure, globalization in particularly has actually facilitated a lot of international movement, not necessarily just of labor, but also capital. And in fact, what happens is regardless of whether you are moving across a nation or you're moving within a nation, right? Once you have these economic opportunities, then we've seen that there is a transfer of income and wealth back to the place of origin for these migrants. And in fact, to give you some data, in 2013, over 247 million people lived outside of their country of birth. And in fact, over 750 million had migrated internally, according to the World Bank data. In South Asia itself, remittance inflows actually grew by about 12% in the year 2018. When it comes to immigration, when it comes to remittances, I'm sure this is not necessarily new to many of us who are attending the talk today. I myself is an example of at least for now, a temporary migrant who has used these opportunities and sent remittances back home many, many times. So this study is actually quite close to home for me as well. This climate right now, because of the COVID-19 pandemic and obviously the associated threat to migration or mobility, I would say is a very important time for us to again reflect and think about why is it that we need to understand what impacts remittances can have on households. Because as we see now, there are events that can happen that actually threaten the process and therefore perhaps the flow of remittances for many households, particularly in the case of Nepal. So obviously, to state the obvious here, this is not the first study looked at the impact of remittances on households. So in general, there have been studies elsewhere outside of Nepal as well. So for example, there was a study done in Indonesia that looked at, and in fact found that remittances have positive impact on food and education spending. There are many other studies done in Colombia, Ghana, Guatemala. So as you can see, these studies span from Central South America to West Africa to East Asia in the Philippines itself. And in fact, these studies found a positive impact of remittances on education expenditures as well. In addition to that, there have been a handful of studies, one in particular that actually even found a positive impact on consumer and other durable or non-durable goods in the case of Guatemala. So these are basically studies that are outside of Nepal. So closer to home, studies on migration and remittances in general. There have been quite a few studies in this area as well. So for example, I do think that if you attended the last series, you actually found some of this by Shrestha, who was the presenter last time. So Shrestha's paper also looks at the impact of migration and in fact finds that the impact is positive. It increases expenditure on food, non-durable items, and education. The thing with Shrestha's paper, however, is that it only focuses on international remittances. And in particular, it only looks at migration to Gulf nations. Then we look at the study from Nepal. She looks at the impact of remittances, and she finds that it actually increases expenditure and education. And just like Shrestha's paper, Nepal also focuses mainly on international remittances. Then we have a paper from Thapa and Acharya that also finds increased expenditure on health and education. With this paper, however, they are only able to control for any potential biases from observables as they use propensity score matching method. Finally, we have a study from Bansak et al. they actually are able to give us a more comprehensive remittance income, because they look at both international and internal remittance income impact, and they find a positive impact on education expenditure. And in fact, they are able to give us a more robust econometric technique because they use an instrumental variable method. So in general, while these studies are in the international context as well as Nepali context, they are obviously useful. They give us information. However, they present an incomplete picture of the relationship between remittances and household expenditure. And therefore, our goal is actually to put a more comprehensive evidence in this front. So in that regard, our research objective is actually twofold. First, we would like to investigate the impact of remittances on household expenditure patterns in Nepal. I'm saying pattern here because as you can see, we have 9 different areas that we are looking at in terms of household expenditure. And the second goal here is, which is more of a minor goal, I also am very much interested in gender, and in fact, gender plays any role in households decide to spend their remittance income. So what we do is, fortunately, we have data on household heads' gender. So we also look at expenditure patterns, whether it differs by the gender of the household head. So in that regard, we hope to contribute to the literature in 2 main ways. Again, we are building on the previous literature, right? So we are standing on the shoulder of giants. However, bringing in from the previous evidence, we hope to present a more comprehensive analysis and a more robust set of results by investigating the impact of remittances on 7 different areas of expenditure. And I would like to particularly highlight here, to the best of our knowledge, we are perhaps the first paper in the context of Nepal specifically to present any evidence on expenditures on tobacco and alcohol, ceremony, agricultural investment, as well as livestock purchase. In addition to that, another contribution that we have from our study is that, in fact, we highlight that remittances can affect household expenditure in non-uniform ways. So as you will see later, we have different ways that remittances impact different types of household expenditure. And then a minor contribution would be, again, we are perhaps the first study, especially in the context of Nepal, to look at remittances impact on household expenditure by the gender of the household head. All right, so again, many of us may already be familiar with a lot of data on Nepal, but to highlight some of the things very quickly on why Nepal is a great case to study remittances is that Nepal actually ranks 5th globally in the ratio of remittances to GDP, according to the Global Economy Database from 2017. When it comes to the share of households receiving remittances, it actually more than doubled from 1995-96 to 2010-11. In particular, the share of households receiving remittances actually increased from about 23% to 56%. And in fact, the share of remittances within the household income increased to 31%, which has in fact even undermined the share of the share of income from agriculture sector, which has reduced from about 60 to 28% in this time period from 1995 to 2010. So as you can see, remittance income is becoming very, very important for households in the Nepali context. So when it comes to agricultural sector, we know that Nepal is predominantly an agricultural employment-based sector, nation. About 65% of the total employment in Nepal is still based in agricultural sector, according to the ILO 2020 data. Another advantage of studying this on Nepal is, if you've done studies, you obviously know that data set is very important. And in fact, the 2010-2011 Nepal Living Standards Survey is really amazing. It gives you comprehensive data on migration status, remittance income, household characteristics, and expenditures, and so on. So when it comes to remittances, again, this is particularly important that we look at remittances from both international and internal sources, because the majority of remittances, in fact, about 58% actually, when it comes to households, how they actually spend remittance income, this way. Of the remittance is spent on food, 11% is spent on housing, about 5% is spent on education, and then the rest, 22% is actually spent on non-food items. This is all, again, according to the central budgets, the NLSS data. The good news is that the percentage of inadequate food consumption in healthcare and schooling has actually reduced from the time period of 1995-96 to 2010 and 11. Before I go into further detail, because we are still talking about the Nepali background and context, I do want to very quickly point out that here we define a migrant, by the way, as a household member. We again follow the NLSS definition. So we are not reinventing the wheel here, but basically a migrant is defined as a household member with a prolonged absence. So they could be absent for anywhere over 6 to 12 months, and they will return to the same household in the future. So by this definition, about 20% of the total population of Nepal are actually a migrant or an absentee, and about 57% of them reside within Nepal, and about them actually reside outside Nepal. This is again according to the CBS definition 2011. Okay, so talking a little bit about the data and sample, the 2010-11 NLSS, which is also known as NLSS 3, because it's basically followed up from the previous data collection. Collected data in 2010-11, which was collected by Nepal's Central Bureau of Statistics with technical support from the World Bank. It is a nationally representative data set, which gives us comprehensive household level information on demographic and socioeconomic characteristics. In fact, it also has very good individual level data on household members' age, ethnicity, their education level, their employment status, and of course, their migration status as well. For the purpose of our study, we use the sample, which is very close to the total sample for this data collection. So we use a total of 5,987 households, which have the non-missing data set for all the variables that have been included in our analysis. And in addition to the NLSS, the third wave of the NLSS survey, in fact, we were very fortunate to also use a supplementary data set, I would say, which is a conflict data by Du and Iyer, which basically is a data on the incidence of casualties during the Maoist insurgency in 1991. So this is the data that records casualties at the district level, regardless of whether the casualty is due to the Maoist or from the state side. So this data set is particularly important for our instrumental variable approach. So before I go further, I would like to define the variables in a little bit more detail. So remittances, for the purpose of our study, have been defined as the total value of cash remittances. So this is both internal and international, received over the past year. And the reason behind just taking the cash value rather than the kind value is that honestly, it's very difficult to think about the value of in-kind remittances, and it's not liquid by nature, right? So therefore we simplified our variable and we just went with the cash remittances over the past year. Then when it comes to the categories of household expenditures, first, we are defining food consumption as the average value of consumed food. And when I say we are defining, this is how the analysis is actually defining this. So we are basically following their definition. Then when it comes to alcohol and tobacco, it is again the total value in Nepalese rupees of the monthly value of the consumed products. When it comes to clothing and personal items, this is the expenditure on or in-kind receipt of clothing, footwear, toiletries, so for example, soap, shampoo, things like that, and personal care items in the past month. When it comes to healthcare, the spending is again on households, healthcare expenditure. So again, if you're ill, you visited hospital, so on and so forth, or any sort of minor expenses as well in the past month. When it comes to education, this is actually done in the past year. So this is any type of spending on schooling. So for example, tuition, uniform, and transportation. And the reason why the analysis has decided to actually do this on a yearly basis is because, as many of us are aware, the tuition system in Nepal is very front heavy, right? So for schools that actually charge any significant amount of tuition, they would usually charge that one particular time of the year. So monthly expenditure would be actually very, very skewed. Ceremonies, pretty similar idea. There are things that happen. So for example, a funeral or some sort of a grand festival, right? So as many of us might be aware, the Sai, for example, only comes during a certain time of the year, and that is usually one of the major expenses for many, many families, many Hindu families for sure. Same thing might be, for example, if you're celebrating Eid. So these, again, make it important to take spending over the past year rather than just monthly expenditure. Same thing with home improvement. It's not very common, right? You might be spending on home maybe one time that year. So that's also measured yearly. Similar thing with agriculture. So agriculture, we are aware, is actually seasonal, right? So spending on input. So input here is, again, a standard definition. So for example, seed, fertilizers, any pesticides, labor hours, so on and so forth, as well as rental costs. So for example, if you're renting a tractor, if you're renting an irrigation system, so on and so forth. So this has been, the spending on this has been accounted over the past agricultural year. And then finally, livestock purchase. So again, this is something that's not very common that happens. So spending in the 12 past months, and this is how livestock purchase is defined. A couple of more notes to actually bring these numbers as close to normality as possible. We have log transformed all of these values for these expenditures as well as remittances, and the top 1% of the values have been top coded to, again, account for extreme values or outliers. So to give you some idea of the descriptive statistics, what exactly does our sample look like? Here we present a very, very obviously a smaller version of what we have in the paper, in the manuscript. So we have presented some variables where the first column, as you can see, is the sample, the whole sample characteristics. Then we divide the sample by households that did not receive remittances and the household that received remittances. And this is a simple t-test comparison across these two households. Okay. First, when you look at how many households, what proportion of households are female, for example, about 27% of our sample are female-headed households. Among them, when you look at the households receiving remittances versus not receiving remittances, a majority of them, right, so about 44% are actually receiving remittances. So this gives us some idea that maybe when, when household members are migrating, maybe a lot of those are majorly male members that are migrating, leaving behind a lot of females to head or to basically be the decider of the households. When it comes to marital status, again, there is some difference. So for example, those households that receive remittances have a lower proportion of household heads that are married. When it comes to education, for example, those households that do not receive remittances, for example, have a lower proportion of heads that have no schooling at all. SLC, which is again a national level standardized exam, those households that receive remittances have a lower number of household head that have gotten or finished this SLC certification. When it comes to wealth quintile, it's very interesting when you look at that. So for example, when it comes to the lowest income quintile, right, the first one, you see that those households receiving remittances have a higher proportion of them, but then this actually sort of like reverses when you look at the highest income quintile, right? So it's actually 25% of them that belong to the highest income quintile that do not receive remittances. When it comes to size, again, there is some difference. Households that receive remittances have lower household size. It's a little bit less. And then when you look at ethnicity, again, we looked at different ethnicities, but I'm just presenting this particular one here. So when it comes to household heads that are Brahmins, they have a higher percentage of that are actually receiving remittances. So as you can see from this, when we look at households that receive versus do not receive, we have about just over 3,000 households that do not receive remittances, and we have about 2,500 households that actually receive remittances. Let's look at how do the outcome variables, right? So how do the household expenditures actually differ across these receiving versus non-receiving households? I can tell you in general, the direction is actually quite intuitive, right? So for example, when you look at the first row and the second and the third columns, there are the average monthly food consumption is actually a little bit higher in the non-receiving remittances, and we would expect this to be actually maybe the opposite. But we have to keep in mind this is a very simple mean t-test comparison that's not controlling at all for any observables and unobservables. So therefore, some of these differences may seem counterintuitive. And then again, when it comes to health and expenditure, so basically when you look at the statistical significant difference, right, all these expenditures, or going back to the previous slide, a lot of those characteristics are actually significantly different across the households that receive remittances versus the households that do not receive remittances. And that gives us a rough idea of, obviously these households are not identical, and therefore we need to think about econometrically how we can solve this problem of perhaps differences based on observables or even unobservables. So we employ two types of empirical method. The first one, we look at simply ordinary least squares. So in our equation, the outcome variable yjk, where j actually stands for household, which is the unit of measurement, the smallest unit of measurement, and then k actually stands for the geographical location. So y takes a value of, either of the expenditures, depending on which outcome regression we are running, right? So it represents either of 9 outcome variables that we're looking at. RJK represents the remittance income, which again, like I said before, it has been log transformed. XJK is a matrix of control variables. We have many, many controls for demographic and financial variables and location characteristics. I'll be happy to talk about this in more detail should you have questions. And then epsilon is actually our error term. Because this data was collected in 2010, these expenditures as well as the remittances have been measured in 2010 Nepali rupees terms. So then, as we know, that remittances is obviously not random, right? Migration is not random. Therefore, there could be potential endogeneity problems. For example, households that may be facing a hard time having enough need met for education expenditure, for example, they might be more likely to push a household member to go away and earn, right? So therefore, keeping this endogeneity issue in mind, or there might be some variables that is, for example, related with both remittances and house expenditures that we may not be able to control for. We employ the instrumental variable two-stage regression model, where we have two different instrumental variables. The first one that we use is, again, based on literature, specifically based on Mansouri 2006. It's actually the community migration network. So the idea here is that if you are a household member that has a lot of network of people who have migrated before, then you have this access to information. What is the labor market like in the places where these people that have migrated? Is there a job opportunity or not? You can get more information. You can find out how to migrate and so on and so forth. So therefore, you'll be more likely to migrate, right? However, these community members' migration should not impact your individual household expenditure at all, right? So that is the idea behind this community migration network. And the way that we have constructed that, it's basically a ratio of total number of migrants in the community to the total number of households in the community. And this is done at the PSU level, which is the smallest unit for data collection by the NLSS. Now, we actually exclude the household's own observations to make the instrumental variable more robust. This is, again, following several literature to do this. In order to actually have variation in our instrumental variable, we again follow literature to interact migration prevalence in the community with the number of adult males. And here, number of adult males is defined as those household members, male members who are older or equal to 21 years of age. The second instrumental variable that we look at is the intensity in past political unrest, right? So this is where I said that we borrowed this data from Du and Iyer, which basically accounts or documents number of deaths at the district level in 1991 during the Maoist insurgency. And this is specifically relevant in the context of Nepal because there's already evidence that suggests that in Nepal, where there are higher incidents of conflict and death, there is a higher incidence of migration. So this is where we have documented evidence that this might be a good instrumental variable for remittances. As it goes, we do use the Kleibergen and PAP and Sargan test for weak instruments and over-identification respectively, and we report our World F statistics for the first stage estimates, and we also report the Hansen J statistics. All right. So I would like to first very quickly go over the OLS results. So as you can see, we have these 9 outcome variables, and we have our independent variables. And for the lack of space, obviously, for conciseness, we are not reporting the other independent variables. However, as you can see, they have been listed in the notes on what are some of the variables that we are controlling for. So for example, we control for household heads' age, we control for their gender, we control for marital status, ethnicity, educational attainment, the size of the household. In fact, we even look at the composition of the household by age group, obviously because of labor availability. And we also look at the number of household migrants. We are controlling for quintiles of total household income. We look at the size of the housing plot. also the size of the agricultural land that the household owns. We also control for credit by looking at the loans obtained in the past 12 months by the household. We're also looking at infrastructure by looking at what is the distance to the paved road. We also control for whether the household is located in a rural versus an urban setting, whether the household is located in Tarai, mountain, and hills. And also because this survey, by the way, is taken over a period of different months, we also control for the month of survey. So when you look at the relationship between remittances as well as these household expenditures, because these both have been log transformed, basically we can interpret them as elasticity, right? So as you can see, a positive change in remittance actually induces a positive change in food consumption, clothing, ceremony, healthcare, education, and so forth, right? But this is still just OLS. So we'll go over and look into a more robust technique, which is the instrumental variable approach. So as you can see, we actually looked at instrumental variables at 2 different levels. So in the first panel, you'll find the results where the only instrumental variable that we used is the community migration rates, which has been interacted with the number of household adult males. And then in the second panel, we actually add the severity of past political unrest as the second instrumental variable. The good news is that regardless of whether we use 1 IV or 2 IVs, the results are actually qualitatively robust, right? So for example, now we find that there is a positive association between change in remittances and change in food consumption, right? So the higher the remittances, the higher the expenditure on food. For example, there's a relatively negative relationship between remittances and alcohol and tobacco. Again, positive relationship on clothing and education, and negative relationship between remittances and agricultural expenditure, as long as and livestock purchase. So we also wanted to, and honestly, I have to give credit for this to one of the reviewers that we had submitted our paper to the journal to. So one of the reviewers pointed out, hey, what if, since obviously a majority of proportion of households receiving remittances are headed by female, what if the expenditures are simply a function of gender rather than remittances? So per their suggestion, we actually looked at the expenditure patterns of remittances on household expenditures by the gender of the household heads. So as you can see in panel A, we present results for male-headed households, and in panel B, we present results for female-headed households. And in fact, what's really interesting is that the results are qualitatively similar, regardless of whether you're looking at male-headed households or female-headed households, with the one minor exception on ceremony expenditure. Okay, so I'd like to discuss these results a little bit more. So in fact, our findings on the increasing remittances increases food expenditure is not surprising, right? It's actually consistent with the literature. In fact, one study by Kumar in the context of Nepal even shows us a positive link between remittances and dietary diversity, right? So for example, fruits and vegetables, proteins, and so on and so forth. Our study has added evidence that remittances may even reduce expenditure on harmful items, right, such as alcohol and tobacco. But it's also to be noted that not all empirical literature finds a positive impact on food and outcomes. In fact, a couple of studies in the context of Ghana and Guatemala find either no statistical impact at all or even reduced impact of remittances on household expenditure. And the intuition behind that is that countries like Ghana and Guatemala, they are actually middle income countries, right? They are much richer. And therefore, remittances may not be needed necessarily to supplement their food needs, for example. Whereas in poorer nations like Nepal, this should be more intuitive. So context really matters here. And then the other finding that we had, increasing remittances actually increases expenditure on clothing and personal items. Again, is supported by literature on non-durable items in the context of Nepal and elsewhere. And then finally, the increased expenditure on education is also corroborated by other studies, again, in the context of Nepal and elsewhere. So these are really good news. In particular, most of the literature, they actually treat food simply as consumption, right? So something that you consume and not necessarily have a lot of future implications. However, we are aware, and there are studies that show that in fact, diet is important for long-term health, and it might even be important for enhancing labor productivity, right? So this finding that we have of increased remittances having positive impact on food, and not necessarily just food, right, but high quality food, by actually reducing impact on bad quality consumption, such as alcohol and tobacco, along with the positive impact on education, is really good news, because this is basically saying that remittances actually help enhance the quality of human capital, which is, again, certainly very important in the context of Nepal, where unfortunately we have not been able to have the productivity of labor as high as we would like it to be. Then another interesting finding that we have is the impact of remittances, which is actually negative on agriculture inputs and livestock purchase. This, again, might have important implications for the Nepal's economic development trajectory, specifically because, as we are aware, majority of employment actually comes from agricultural sector. So there could be a couple of things that might be happening on how remittances might be changing household behavior. So for example, as households have more income from a remittance source, right, they might be seeing agricultural income as maybe less important. So therefore, they may not be as motivated to invest on agriculture and livestock, right? So that might be one thing. The other thing, which is again related, might be that as you see the importance of another source of income, right, then maybe that might even push you eventually to move away from the agriculture sector, and therefore you may not see the importance of investing in agriculture. But these are obviously speculation at this point, because, like I said, this is relatively new evidence. Then the other interesting finding that we had is that largely there are no differences in expenditure patterns across gender of the household head, right? And that's actually pretty good news, in the sense that we see that remittance is important for several areas of expenditure for both male and female headed households. However, there was one exception. So the female headed households have positive and significant impact on ceremonies. And again, I'm not sure about how it is in your houses, but I've certainly noticed, and in fact, there is abundant literature in this area as well, that females tend to be more social and they tend to be more religious. So therefore, maybe it should not be surprising that when they have this liquid added earning, right, then they might be more likely to spend on, festivals or other social ceremonies. Now, having said that, there are certainly limitations to our study. So for example, our study only accounts for, obviously, the 12-month timeframe that is allowed by the data set that we are looking at, which might be too short to pick up a lot of behavioral changes, right? So for example, one of the things that we found is we failed to find actually any statistical significant impact on home improvement. And honestly, intuitively, I would think that we would find a positive impact, right? So that's where our time frame may not necessarily be helpful. The other thing that I wanted to point out is in at least one case, so in terms of the ceremony, we actually rejected the over-identification assumption. So that therefore, maybe we should interpret this finding that in fact, females might be spending more on ceremonies a little bit cautiously. And we also had one instance of weak instrument for male-headed households. But the fact that we have more than one instrument actually helps our case in this one. So to conclude, basically, again, remittances are important source of household income, especially in developing societies where they may not have abundant income earning opportunities, especially in the context of COVID-19, where mobility has been obviously curtailed and there are barriers now. It is important to understand the role that remittances play in household expenditure so that we can see how these things might change in the foreseeable future should COVID-19 actually restrict travels. So in that regard, again, using data from the NLSS third wave, we employ ordinary squares and instrumental variable methods to look at the impact of remittances on 9 different areas: food, tobacco, and alcohol, clothing spending, ceremonies, healthcare, education, home improvement, agricultural inputs, and livestock purchase. And in fact, we find that remittances has non-uniform impact on expenditure patterns, right? So for example, it has stronger and positive effects on goods which have high human capital content, right? So for example, high quality food, and it has, or education, for example, and it has negative impact on things that are bad for your health. So for example, tobacco and alcohol, and it also has negative impacts on agriculture inputs as well as livestock purchase. In addition to that, we actually fail to find evidence on any statistical impact on ceremonies in general, on healthcare, and on home improvement. So overall, I think one takeaway from our findings is that just as how governments use, for example, other social programs, right? So it could be a pension program, it could be an old age cash transfer, other type of social benefits to actually improve the household welfare. Government can also think about remittances as one, and in fact, very important tool to actually enhance welfare of households. And therefore, maybe, remittances should be, migration should be encouraged and maybe even subsidized, or at least there should be policies that could perhaps reduce the barriers for migration and therefore increase remittances that could help households do better and therefore improve the livelihoods of population, especially in the context of Nepal. So this is where I would like to conclude my presentation. If you would like to get in touch, contact with me. That's my email and that's my Twitter handle. I also have an account on LinkedIn, and that's my free Google website that I created when I was on the job market 3 years ago when finishing my PhD. Thank you so much for your patience, and I look forward to your questions. I look forward to your comments and your suggestions. Like I said, this paper is under revise and resubmit, so I really appreciate any suggestions and comments. Thank you all.
Excellent. Thanks, Khushbu. Thanks for the presentation. Remittance is definitely the most important source of income here in Nepal, maybe one of the most. The kind of variables that you looked at, the impact of remittance on these variables, were actually also looked at not in a causal sense, but in a descriptive sense by Central Bank in 2014-15. They actually did a study of 320 households from 16 districts, and they looked at how they spend their remittance money on loan, food, health, even marriage and Vratabandha, which you regarded as ceremony. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And also on savings. Actually, the saving rate, I remember maybe 20 years ago, there was another study where the saving rate was like 0%. Oh. But right now it's 28% per household. So remittance is very important. We also talk about the use of remittance, how it is being used, because we get almost $12 billion, maybe $10 to $12 billion per year, formally, informally. And that's a lot of money here. It's like 25%, 30% of GDP, which you also mentioned, in the beginning of your presentation. And it is also very important research in the sense that many scholars, Mahesh Shresthaji, Apsaraji, that you cited, many other researchers in your work, they have worked on the impact of remittance on different household expenditure, child labor, labor market outcomes, other things also. So this is pertinent. Many people are concerned about these things right now. So this is great research to, at least right now. Obviously, in all economics, especially if you use instrumental variables, everybody will have tons of questions about instrumental variable, whether it's good, whether you are capturing whatever you are capturing, whether it is correlated with whatever variable you are saying, tons of questions on that. And I'm sure you will be, you are expecting that. There are tons of questions on in the validity of instrument variables. Here also, I'll go to them. I think I will ask our listeners to maybe ask question directly. I don't know if that is allowed. I just want to say a couple of other stuff. I think what I really found interesting was the impact of remittance reduced the expenditure on alcohol and tobacco. So basically, people were not budget constrained on these and the consumption of these things before, something like that. So when they have additional income, they were spending more money on food, clothing, and education, but spending less money on alcohol and tobacco. Basically, people are maybe it has a lot of implications. I think what were people doing before? Stuff like that. But this is interesting for me. This is really interesting. Also, the reduced expenditure on agriculture and livestock. It has if it stands, it has a serious consequence for other things also. So. But excellent. Why don't we start with our, the listeners? There were tons of questions actually in chat. We don't have a lot of time. So everybody, please be very pointed in your question. Dr. Bora, you had many questions. Why don't we start from your comments?
Well, I just, thank you. It's just a suggestion rather than question.
Sure.
Basically, along the same line of alcohol consumption, there's been some quite a bit research linking the income and alcohol. And of course, there's a lot of genetic factor as well. But that aside, I was wondering if the missing from the household was one of the causes of the reduction in alcohol. The males are the ones who are working abroad. So maybe that's one reason. The other one is whether or not they have substituted that out for lots of other addictions, such as soda, sugary product, and junk food. Right now, they're available in Nepal. So that's, and the other question I had was, since you are estimating these different expenditure, I wonder if you could estimate them as a systems of expenditure function, as a, expenditure function, so that you can also take into account the potential correlation across different equations.
Expenditures, right?
And allow substitutability. And the final point I have for you is whether or not you had taken into account the cost of living differences across the geographic region.
These are all very good points. And so to get to the first point on tobacco and alcohol. So the thing is that we do control for the number of household members that are available, that are left behind. And in fact, we even control for, a number of adult males that are there. So it may not be necessarily just a gender factor. However, I do think that your second point on that, perhaps maybe there are increased expenditure on sugary products, right? Things that are seen maybe fancier when you have income. So that's something that I think that's a really good point. So that's something that my co-authors and I will probably look into more and see if that's what is going on, right? If there's some substitution effect going on there. Then potentially exploring this as an expenditure function to account for correlation across these. I think that's a very good point as well. We can certainly do that. To your third point about cost of living, so like I said, we do control for geographic location. So we don't have like a specific cost of living thing in there, but we do control for example, whether it's rural or urban, whether it's Tarai versus mountain. So that should give us some control. But was there anything specific that you're thinking of, Dr. Bora? You are
Dr.
on
Bora?
mute.
Or maybe, you
think
can talk
NLS,
to...
Sorry. And I think NLSS also gives you the price adjusted expenditure on health. At least they had done in a previous NLSS data. So you can actually get the, the inflation adjusted expenditure. So that's one. And the other final point is, why do you have the number of migrants as well as the remittances on the right-hand side at the same time? Aren't they correlated?
Yeah, so we actually checked for that, and there wasn't a super high correlation. And this is number of male migrants, by the way. So this is not the number of total migrants. This is only in the OLS. In the IV, then we actually interact for the community level migration network with the number of male adults. So yeah, that is a very good point as well. Thank you.
So there are tons of questions on instrumental variable. I think
For
I
sure.
pick one.
Yeah.
I pick Moniji's question, Moni Nepalji's questions, but a lot of people are curious about it. I think each question is basically both instruments, migration network and conflict. They may be linked to migration and not remittances. What do you think about that?
That is a pretty good point. I think my straightforward answer would be that our FSTAT is very high from our first stage. So I think that pretty much answers the question. Yes, obviously they are correlated with migration, and migration is very, very highly correlated, almost obviously a cause of remittances. So in that sense, I would say that they are correlated. I'm not sure if there was a specific concern. So I apologize if I don't understand your concern properly.
Biswaji, just I just want to add a few things. So when we look at this migration network, that basically affects the migration. But migration and the remittances are actually not 100% same. There's a quite variation. People migrate and then they don't send remittance. Some people send, some don't send. So here. It is assumed that migration is remittance and remittance is migration, which is difficult to justify. So and these instruments are actually used for migration literature, not for remittance literature. Most of the time, even if they are used, it is difficult to justify actually. So what is the logic? Why migration network actually increases remittances? Those kind of things. I think it should be a little bit more, if you can give more clear, justification for using those instead of looking at the statistics aside, what is the logic? That's what I was interested to listen. Thank you. Same thing with the conflict.
Again, thank you so much. I'm afraid I don't have a different answer in this case. So I'm not sure if I'll be able to completely satisfy you right now in the interest of limited time, but I would love to have a discussion with you one-on-one, maybe after this formal time is over. So basically, unfortunately, I'm gonna maybe at the risk of repeating myself. And again, obviously, there have been literature that have used this. I actually cited literature when I talked about these instruments that we used. And in addition to that, like I said, obviously they are not going to be 100% correlated, right? But I don't think the idea of an instrument is to have 100% correlation, because if that actually happens, that is actually a problem for an instrument, right? You want a high correlation. You don't want 100% correlation. But like I said before, I'm happy to discuss this further with you one-on-one, Maniji. So thank you so much for your concern.
So one more, not one more, another question is, it's the IV effects, they are all more pronounced than OLS. This is from Abhijit Acharyaji. So, could you comment if this is CEV situation, or what is the explanation for that? Also, following up on previous question, I did not see your previous question, I guess. The effect on tobacco and alcohol in IV is identical for households headed by women and men. I'm curious if this is also true in the OLS, and if so, why do you think the effect size is the same?
So the direction is certainly the same. I'm not sure if, so yes, qualitatively, they are certainly same in the IV. So anyway, so there are two questions. So I guess I'll take them one by one. The reason for, again, maybe seeing some difference across the OLS versus the IV would be that, again, hopefully we have accounted for selection based on unobservables. I very quickly pointed out earlier that the nature of remittances itself is actually endogenous, right? So whereas, yes, having more money from remittances can help you spend more on outcomes, for example, food consumption, it can also happen that households that do not have enough money to begin with might be more likely to send somebody away to work so that they can get money, right? So there can be a reverse causality issue in the worst case scenario. So in that sense, if these impacts are biased, then hopefully accounting for instrumental variable can give us more statistically robust results. As you may have noticed, these results were not necessarily uniform, right? So in the sense that, whereas we've found that, as you rightly noticed, for things like food consumption and alcohol and tobacco, even though the numbers were different, right, the directions were actually positive and significant. But for alcohol and tobacco, actually, so going to your second part of the question, it was actually negative. For the OLS, the sign was negative. However, it was not statistically significant. So the IV actually added the statistical significance there. And honestly, I would love for you or anybody else to help me think about this further and help me solve the puzzle. So yes, while we do present, and we are maybe the first paper to present that remittance income actually, in fact, statistically significantly reduces consumption on alcohol and tobacco, we don't look at what the mechanism could be, right? So what could be, why is it that we find this? It would be super helpful to think about this and discuss this. So I would welcome any reasons or any intuitions that you may have. And like I said before, it happens despite controlling for gender. And as you rightly noticed, it happens regardless of who is the head of the household, whether it's a male or whether it's female. But I think Dr. Bohra's suggestion, I found that quite insightful, that maybe they are spending more on other things, for example, soda and stuff. So.
But it's still, I think, not clear why they are spending on other things. So this, the mechanism of why, what is driving this is not clear yet.
Yeah, so like I said before, we are unfortunately in our study, we are not necessarily looking at the mechanisms, but I do think I think there is some economic intuition here, right? So if you are constrained in terms of your spending, then obviously having more liquid money can help you spend more. And in fact, as you see, the households spend more and significantly higher in most areas, with an exception of agricultural, livestock, and tobacco, which is where we actually see the negative impact. So alcohol and tobacco, I think that's definitely the greatest puzzle. And the intuition behind agriculture and livestock, honestly, is that maybe the households are seeing increased importance of remittance, and therefore maybe the importance of agricultural sector is perhaps going down, especially when they see income coming from some other source. I have definitely seen anecdotal evidence on this front, but I don't have a systemic evidence. I think it would be super useful if we can find other studies that perhaps when they control for these unobservables or try to establish a causational relationship, if we can actually find other evidence, and that would be more robust. Ours is the only evidence at this point, so it's mostly suggestive. I would not call this a super robust, systemic at least.
Yeah, I think the questions from Kedar Neopaniji and Om Pantaji are also addressed.
Yeah, thank you. Can I come in then? Sorry. Is it okay if I speak now? Kedar Neopani is speaking.
Please go ahead and be quick, please.
Yeah, no. I have a comment and there's just a question. And thank you for the good presentation, Dr. Khushbu. I don't know if you had a chance to look at the Nepal Policy Institute's research, last year's rapid research. What we found there, similar to what you said, the migrant workers were spending a lot of money, a large chunk in paying the loans, because most of them have taken a loan while traveling. And then the rest of things, I think it follows food, etc., which is what exactly you found. And I was a little bit surprised because it didn't come out in your research that they were paying off the loans. And then in the end, when they had some savings, they were spending money on the real estate, buying land, etc., which is customary. That's my comments. And just to have a question, you in your finding you said undermine agriculture, and I was surprised because I thought it was reduce agriculture. As an economist, we all know when household income goes, people expenditure pattern change, and normally Nepal is an agrarian society. When you have little money, it goes into the consumption pattern, and definitely. But the advantage also is that now I have seen some reports, the forestry has become good because people are not cultivating. There is a good otherwise environmental concern. Did you ever had a chance to look at that also? That's all I have. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kedarji, for these points. As you rightly pointed out, we did, even though we looked at 9 different outcome variables, right? We did not necessarily look at paying off the loans. And I guess we were not thinking necessarily of credit variables as outcome variables, to be honest. So that's why we did not look at it, but this is a very good point. And in fact, I would love for you to send me the link or email me the study that you referred to from the Nepal Policy Institute. I'd love to take a look at it, and we would love to explore this paying off loans as an outcome variable. I'm totally open to that. The second point that you said on forestry, impact on forestry, again, we are looking simply at household expenditure. So I'm afraid that this is beyond the scope of our paper, but this is a great idea. And should I have more time and should my co-authors be interested, we would love to explore this as a potential, a little bit more macro level topic, it seems like, on forestry as well. So thank you so much for these comments.
Okay, so next question, I want to go back to Avij's question again. Can you report what is the residual impact of remittances? For example, if a 1% increase in remittance results in smaller than 1% increase or decrease in consumption in these 9 areas, how much of the extra remittance money is spent in other areas besides these 9?
Yeah, so that is a very good question. Honestly, we haven't looked at how much is being spent on other areas, but I did present I haven't looked at it econometrically, but we did look at the descriptive statistics. So that's something that I can tell you, but I can certainly get back to you. I can do some analysis for you and get back to you. Feel free to please email me or leave me a comment here, and I'll get these comments from Binisha later. So the highest is spent on food, and then followed by, I'll have to go and check. But yeah, I guess the short answer is that unfortunately, I don't have the econometric estimation for you. I only have descriptive statistics.
So it's actually quite simple. You can simply just sum up all of, since these are all elasticities, you can sum up the coefficients that you get, and basically, well, you need to know the proportions that are spent. So you need to take the weighted sum, and then you can basically find out what the residual amount is. Yeah.
Right. So I would have to go and do that. I can't just produce that for unfortunately, the questioner right now, but I'd be happy to provide this to you. So please email me or send me a message.
Binishaji, should I ask one more last question, or?
Yes, we
It's
do
5
have
more
5.
minutes.
Yeah, we do have 5 more minutes left.
5 more minutes. I thought, Biswas will say something at the end.
Yes,
Anyway, so let's go quickly over Prishta's question. After having examined how remittance is used at household level, how has this research changed your understanding of how remittance or labor migration impact Nepal economy? If remittance income makes people less inclined to invest in agriculture, would you expect higher than 5% investment in education?
Yeah, this is a loaded question, and this is definitely this research has given me a pause. And I'll tell you personally how I felt about this. And the first part of the question is definitely something that I am a little concerned about, right? So as the ILO data tells us, over 65% of the employment is actually in the agricultural sector, right? And in fact, if remittances reduce the expenditure or the importance from the house level on agricultural sector, yes, at some level, right, it's really good because the household welfare increases. But when we think about the macro economy, right, and even though I'm not a macroeconomist, this is something that I have definitely been pondering upon. While in the short run or in the micro terms, it does increase the household expenditure, and it's good especially for lower wealth quintiles households because they did not have this. They obviously had a credit constraint before. How does this impact the longer term labor supply or the macroeconomy of Nepal, right? So I am a little bit hesitant to propose this as a policy implication that, hey, we should make sure that we send all our labor across, right, abroad, and again, so international labor is something that I'm not necessarily proposing, but our study look at, in fact, combined effect of the internal and the external migration. So this is something that definitely needs to be thought about. And like I said before, ours is the first study that finds the negative impact on agriculture expenditure and livestock expenditure. So we would love it if there were other studies that presented either evidence on Nepal using a different data set or a different methodology, or in fact, if we found studies that are in a similar context to Nepal, so that we could see, in fact, if this is a robust evidence that is corroborated by other literature. So that's basically a response to the first part of your question. I apologize. What was I'm not sure if I understood if there was a follow-up or a second part to the question.
If remittance income makes people less inclined to invest in agriculture, would you expect higher than 5% investment in education? I think she's talking about 5% budgetary investment in education.
Yeah, so let me ask you, are you talking about 5% investment as a total expenditure of the household, or 5% investment from the remittance? And honestly, regardless of which one of these your question might be, I think it'll be difficult for me to formulate the exact statistics. However, I can certainly do a back of the envelope calculation, and depending on the elasticities that we found, and when I actually calculate and answer the other earlier question that we had, what about expenditures on other areas besides the 9 areas that we've looked at, I think we can give you a more robust answer.
I wanted to ask this last question. Ashish Bajraj, did you look at the analysis panel also at all, to look at the evolution of spending? And I care about this question because I was never able to connect these households.
Yeah, no.
I can actually tell you, I mean, how to track these households.
Correct. Yes.
I couldn't use the panel. I know this data exists for 3 different years, but not as panel.
Of course. Unfortunately, the problem with data set, the panel data set, in fact, when we first started doing the study, we actually wanted to incorporate the panel data set. However, the sample size is so small that after accounting for the missing variables, the missing data for some of the variables that we're looking at. And because, we are looking at 9 different outcome variables, unfortunately, we only had about just over 900 sample of the panel. So it was highly underpowered. It was difficult to get any statistically meaningful results from that. But yeah, Dr. Poudel, I'm so sorry to disappoint you. Please feel free to go try it out. And if it works out for you, please let me know, because for us, it was just super underpowered and the sample size was very small. Yeah.
I think that's all for today. Dr. Goshen, will you?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Poudel. First of all, let me thank Dr. Mishra for presenting a very interesting and insightful paper on how remittance is shaping household expenditure in Nepal. Remittance has indeed played an instrumental role in lifting millions of people out of poverty in South Asia. The impact of remittance is not only limited to overcoming income poverty, but also addressing other forms of deprivation, including access to basic services such as education and health services, as highlighted by Dr. Mishra. As we all know, Nepal is one of the major recipients of remittance. Having born and brought up in a rural part of the country, I can see the transformation happening in the lives of the poor people in the last 2 decades, essentially spurred by remittance. An extra cash in the hands of a mother in a village would immediately expand her choices of the food she would prepare for her family. Rice and meat considered as the festive delicacies by the majority of poor households have now become more affordable with a rise of income level due to remittance. As the flow of income becomes stable and regular and a search for better life with improved living conditions continues, and internal migration from rural areas to urban areas will also rise. This has led to a fall in agriculture and livestock activities as a growing number of villages is getting deserted and the arable lands are becoming barren in the remote areas. These developments are also reflected in the paper presented today. A sudden and massive drop in the remittance inflows in the first 2 months of lockdown, exacerbated by a fear of a very large repatriation of Nepali migrant workers due to COVID-19 pandemic, had presented a very bleak socio-economic outlook of the country. However, the country witnessed a record inflows of remittance in the subsequent period, allaying fears of the economic crisis. While a sound external balance safeguarded the country from external shocks for its macroeconomic stability, the continued inflows of remittance provided the households a very crucial safety net against the adverse impacts of the prolonged lockdown and restrictions at the micro level. I take this opportunity to thank Dr. Acharya for steering IIDS monthly webinar series in politics, economy, and public policy, and Dr. Poudel for moderating today's session. We are encouraged by the level of participation and the quality of the papers presented in our webinar series. Finally, I would like to thank you all for accepting our invitation and participating in today's session. I look forward to your participation in our next episode scheduled on the first Monday of the next month. Before I conclude, I take this opportunity to thank Vinisa for coordinating our webinar series. Thank you very much.